Hello, and welcome to this video on the social and political and economic background of the New Testament. In short, the world, the New Testament world that provided all of the conditions necessary for not just for the mission to occur, but also that created the conditions for the writings of the New Testament itself. It's important to have at least some basic grasp of the kind of world that the writers of the New Testament lived in, the kinds of pressures, the kinds of forces, the kinds of institutions that they lived in and through and around, and that they depended on in a lot of ways. Now, the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world that encompasses all of the New Testament was one that, for sure, placed kinship at the center. Family life, especially for Judean or even Syrian villagers or peasants, family life, and in particular the ancestral lands that they had inherited, called Nahala, were very, very important to them. Now, of course, in comes the Roman Empire, which, like many other empires before that occupied that land, functioned according to a tributary economic political arrangement. Tributary meaning it depended on the tribute of conquered or occupied lands. So there was a lot of payment, sometimes in kind, but a lot of payment of tributes, that is giving money or crops and other things over to the reigning authorities, and as well as paying taxes. And even at times, as is depicted in the Gospels, the fishermen like Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, they were taxed and had to pay levies or other tariffs at the Sea of Galilee on the shores in order to keep and sell their fish. So it was very, very interesting situation, and a very tough one as well, one that placed a lot of challenges on peasant families. But when we move away from there, we of course focus on the cities, the large cities, more or less large cities that were located in each of the Roman provinces. These of course housed a lot of the elites. The elites at times were the ones who owned the largest farmland in the outskirts, in the hinterland outside of the cities. A lot of times they were large because they in many ways seized the nahalas, the small holdings of peasants who could not pay up their taxes. Perhaps they had a bad harvest. Perhaps they became ill. Perhaps somebody died in the family. There's a number of different reasons why they may not have been able to actually pay up their taxes. And of course, relying on kin could help, and at times was able to quell an impending disaster, but at other times it was not possible. Of course, folks at times that were either went into slavery or had to give over, before that, had to give over their ancestral lands, which were, especially for Jews, considered something that was inalienable. You were not to give away your land. It certainly was not to be lost in perpetuity, that is, forever. As we know, the call of Jubilees in the Old Testament was to restore people's lands to them so that they could have a livelihood. But in this case, there was a lot of land being seized. The elites lived in these cities. In the cities, the elites were like a network of folks that worked for the Roman Empire, especially that were Romans. Below those elites that were definitely either rooted in ancestry, or that had some kind of governmental position or post. In a city, for example, like Antioch, we'll take that as an example. There may have been 3 or 4 legions there. So thousands, 30,000, 40,000 soldiers in that city, in a city that perhaps had 100,000 to 150,000 people at its apex. So there was quite a presence there. And then, of course, there were those that had quite a bit of land holdings. People who were actually involved in commerce, in trade, were not necessarily viewed with a great and positive attitude by some of the elites in the cities. The artisans, or people who had inconsistent business, were not necessarily part of the elite. Some of the large landowners, which they figure very, very prominently. You'll find them in so many of Jesus's parables, right? The relationship between large landowners and other people was something that very much influenced Jesus's upbringing and his life, and he uses the relationship between those two for a lot of his parables, because they did hold sway, especially in defining who was in and who was out in daily life. Then, of course, below these elites, we find the retainers, right? Those who support the elites. The lawyers, the tax collectors, quite a bit of course, soldiers, and others who were responsible for helping them collect their taxes and maintain order. Below them, you find a very, very large amount, again, following the example of Antioch, a large amount of people who were quite poor. In this case, maybe 5 to 10% of Antioch was elite, and the rest were non-elite. And the non-elite, of course, may have been people who were artisans, who were merchants who lived in the city, or day laborers, perhaps, who lived in the city. There could be tanners, there could be farriers, there could be all sorts of even singers, dancers, flutists. There's quite a list that I could actually read to you here. A few inlayers, mill hands, coopers, carpenters, fresco painters, floor layers, plasterers, cleaners, weavers, dyers, rag pickers, bag makers, tailors, felterers, bronze, silver, gold, iron, and nailsmiths. There were quite a bit of different folks. And even food vendors and other such. So you could imagine the scene here if we use our imagination. But then once you start moving out of the city and you go to the rural areas, you find many, many poor there who usually either have a small land holding and work their own land, or ones who live on a land that they have an agreement with a landowner who lives in the city, which of course may remind you of a lot of Jesus's parables. They're a sharecropper. They're like a tenant, farmer-tenant agreement. And many times the relationship between these two, just like all the relationships in the Roman Empire, depended on patron-client relationships. In this case, the patron and the client supported one another, but it was an unequal relationship. The patron was somebody who's like a benefactor. They gave a lot of, they arranged for this person's work. They would perhaps provide them with some housing or other opportunities for work. Then this other person followed them. In a sense, they were loyal to them and gave them honor and respect. But it was most certainly not a two-way relationship in that sense. The client was not necessarily supposed to like the patron, and the patron most certainly did not have to like the client. So if the client in this case came under disease or duress, it was completely up to the patron to help them. It was to their basically according to their discretion. So when we move out there to the land, to the rural areas, you may find, of course, day laborers who again are featured in a number of gospel stories. They could or could not have land, but it was a very, very precarious existence. Most of the people who lived out in the rural areas struggled for subsistence level living, and these are in many ways some that Jesus finds when he begins his ministry in Galilee. And is perhaps large amounts of these people are the ones to whom he preaches Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. Anyway, but you could see the relationship between all these different groups of people, and these forces are very, very compelling and important to understand. You have the cities, the polis, that very much depends on the outlying lands for their wealth and their work. And then once you get into the city, you find, of course, that quite a bit of the governmental structures are Roman, but the Romans have found some accommodationists, some helpers, some supporters from the local leadership. So, for example, in Jerusalem, we find that the priests, including the Sadducees, had to find out certain ways of getting along with the Roman imperial presence, the prefect or the legate, to make sure that they could get along and that they still led. Now, usually the Roman Empire picked somebody that they thought would get along with them well and would not challenge them. And we see the struggle for status and reputation and stability when they're trying to decide what to do with Jesus so that he does not rock the boat, so that he does not upset their arrangement. Of course, in this comes the very real feelings of jealousy and rage and hatred that start to emerge when one's comfort is challenged. Right. So it was a world that could be quite violent. Both the establishment the Roman Empire would of course try to quell any crowd violence, anything that seemed to border on rioting or any sort of movement, emergence of groups of people. They tried to get rid of those as quickly as they could, but at the same time, people did view themselves as either a member of the Roman Empire or a Gentile, a Greek, for example, and then the others, right? The barbarians, those who are uncivilized. And in many ways, that's how, at the broadest level, from the Roman Empire's perspective, that's how they viewed it. It's the Roman Empire, the civilized, and all those that we're conquering and to whom we're bringing civilization. And then, of course, from the local level, you have a place like Jerusalem, or Antioch, or Caesarea, or Sepphoris, right? Sepphoris, a city that had almost been built to introduce Hellenistic and Roman ideas to the place, to that area of occupied Palestine, as such, it was a place where there was probably quite a bit of tension between Jews in their lands, and then of course that being the intersection of a whole lot of other ethnic groups like Syrophoenicians, Cretans, who knows, there could be people from Egypt there, Athenians. So all of these groups lived in these cities. So from the local level, there was quite a bit of mixing up going on, and quite a bit of interaction. And that is true because the last thing I'll mention about these cities is that they were incredibly dense. Antioch, for example, probably had close to 200 people per square acre, which compares to Chicago, that I think is perhaps in the 30s or 40s, and New York, which is maybe close to 70 or 80 per acre. So these were places where it was probably hard to find some privacy. There were people literally at times on top of one another in terms of their living spaces and living arrangements. So it was a place where, just like any that we may or may not live in, it will challenge us to develop a maturity and a attentiveness and a devotion that can keep us close to what is most important in God's world and in God's kingdom. So with that, you can kind of chew on those words and consider next time to include those considerations in your reading of the Gospels and the New Testament. Thank you.